Hi, my name is Natalie, and today I'm here with my dad to talk about the Maze Runner series by James Dashner. So I'm going to give a brief overview about what the Maze Runner series is about. In this world, the world is ravaged by solar flares, and they have a bunch of kids that they're trying to use for an experiment. And the main character's name is Thomas, and he arrives up in a box in this place called the Glade. And he doesn't remember who he is, where he is, or anything about his past, really. And he's kind of just there. And then there's all these boys running around the area, and they tell him, welcome to the Glade. And so the whole series follows these kids as they go from the place called the Maze, which is the Glade, and then they travel to a bunch of other places through different trials and experiments, all to find a cure for this thing called the flare, which is the disease that was caused after the solar flares. It makes people go crazy and is very dangerous, but these kids have something special about them that makes them so interesting to study and to experiment on. So that's our brief overview. Now we're going to go into spoilers. So, spoiler alert! So, The Maze Runner is comprised of 3 main books and 2 prequels. Today, we're mostly going to be talking about the first book, The Maze Runner. Okay, so what did you think of The Maze Runner?
I first ran across The Maze Runner by catching part of the first movie that was made. It should be pointed out that a movie was made of each of the 3 main books. The books and the movies deviate in quite a few details, but the basic story remains the same. So I first saw The Maze Runner first movie on television, but I only saw a small part of it. And I thought, okay, this is kind of interesting. But then when I saw the very end and how it ended, it was, wow, okay, now I need to know what happens in the next book and the next movie. So I started reading the books, and then we got caught up on the movies. The third movie just came out about a year and a half ago. So by then we had both read all the books, so we were caught up. And I thought it was very interesting, young adult, dystopian future story in which the main character is Thomas, who, as Natalie said, starts off the series and in the movie by being put into a cage-like elevator, being elevated to a surface, and when he comes out, he's in something called the Glade, a big outside area that has also a number of other young boys who have been brought up there one at a time, and now they number, probably several dozen. And they learn to live with each other, but their main focus is to try to solve the maze, which is part of the Glade, where you can go into the maze and try to figure out what it means and how to get through it. But you can't just wander through at any time because there are destructive creatures that come out later in the day that will kill you unless you're able to escape back into the Glade. So with that, our interest was piqued, and we watched the first movie, started to read the books, and then we watched the other 2 movies.
Yeah, so as we said before, we are now in a spoiler section. So the main thing that we want to know about the Maze Runner that really, I think, intrigued us was the organization Wicked. So I'm wearing my Wicked shirt right now, which stands for World and Catastrophe Kill Zone Experiment Department. It's basically the name of the organization. And in the beginning of the movie, we kept hearing this thing. It's like, Thomas, Wicked is good. And we're all like, well, what does that mean? And then we kind of find out at the end, oh my gosh, Wicked is this organization that's experimenting on these kids because they're immune to this virus called the flare. And I don't know, I would think that usually I'd be turned off by this kind of thing because of the violence and a lot of other really crazy things, especially that happen in the second book, but we're not talking about that one exactly right now, that I would usually say, no, I don't like this. But when I saw the first movie, I was like, okay, where's the book? I'm reading this. It's one of the first series that I saw the movie before I read the book because I didn't think I would read the book based on what it was about. Once I knew what it was about, I was so intrigued and interested. The characters were lovable and amazing. Newt all the way. Anyway.
So at first, when Thomas comes into the glade, he's what they call a greenie, someone who's new. Because remember, most of the others had been there, in some cases, for years, because they only bring up one person at a time over a period of many months. So Thomas has to find his place in this group, and he has some duels with who is basically the leader of the group, whose name is Gally. And Gally and Thomas kind of square off at first as to who's going to be sort of a leader, but they find out that Thomas is someone who is very good at being able to run and has good endurance. So he is his job, and each of the boys there has a particular job, whether they're a cook, whether they're a builder, whether they're a defender. Thomas becomes what is called a maze runner, and his job is to, when the maze opens in the morning, he and another person, Minnow, their object is to run through the maze to try to map it out and try to make kind of a mental picture of what the maze looks like so they can build a model to figure their way through the maze. Unfortunately, the maze changes from time to time. It doesn't remain static. So figure trying to find your way through one of these mazes with a pencil and paper, but as soon as you start to figure it out, the maze changes. So Thomas becomes a maze runner, and with Minnow they try to figure out the maze. But as I said, the problem is there are creatures that are sort of mechanical, part live creatures that basically look like spiders or scorpions whose sting can be deadly. And they come out more at night when the maze is starting to close. So you need to get out or face the consequences.
So basically, those things that you talk about, the things that were and are bad and are half like alive, half not. They're basically, big blob creatures with things. They're called grievers, and in the maze they have these little things that if you get stung by one, it injects you with this sort of poison, but not exactly. And that is supposed to be kind of like a mutated version of the flare. So they're testing these kids to see if the virus changed, if they would still survive. The only problem is when they sting the first kids, they don't know that, they don't have a cure yet. And so a lot of the people end up dying. And in the maze, they keep track of all the people who've died, and they have a special place where all the dead people are buried and everything. And one key part of the story that you kind of start figuring out that there's some deep, dark background going on is that one of the people gets stung. I think his name was Ben. Okay, he got stung, and he started going ravagely mad, and he almost killed Thomas, which is kind of really bad because, they're all supposed to be in there to help support one another because they're all stuck in that situation, and they don't know why they're there. They're just there. It should also be important to note that all of them are named after famous scientists, and they don't know what their real names are. So Thomas is named after Thomas Edison, and as I said before, Newt is named after Sir Isaac Newton, and a bunch of other, people are named after different scientists. The big important thing that happens when they're in the maze that kind of reveals that something different is changing is when the first girl shows up, Teresa.
So that is one of the big shakeups, is that previously it had been all boys. And now Teresa is brought into the maze, and she's in the same boat. She doesn't remember anything, how she got there, much about her background. And of course, the boys become pretty suspicious as to why she's there, because after all, they don't know exactly who they could trust, especially the new ones. And of course, there's the mysterious group that manipulates the maze. Who are they? And there's a big discussion throughout the boys and later Teresa as to whether they should just live in the glade, which is a benign area, except from time to time the maze is opened up and the grievers can attack without warning. So some of them want to be more aggressive and want to run into the maze and finally find some kind of escape, and others do not. So that's another point of tension. And I said Teresa adds another point of contention because, well, she's a girl amongst all the boys and they don't trust her, but yet she proves herself to be very brave and resourceful. And of course, a budding relationship develops with Thomas that will go back and forth like a seesaw throughout the rest of the book. So basically, the book somewhat concludes with basically finally getting some information as to how to decode the maze. And there's a lot of the story has to do with how they figure out what the maze means, how to decode what it's trying to tell them. And then finally at the end, there's a mass escape attempt. And at the end of the mass escape attempt, in which they must face the grievers and to be able to find their way through the maze and discover some of the secrets of the maze, at the end, what made me want to read the rest of the books and see the movies was the very surprising ending that launched you into the next book and the rest of the episode. So that was the clincher for me. I had to know what was going to happen after that.
So now we're going to kind of talk about the ending. So the story contains about 7 main characters throughout the course. There are more or less, there's more characters than that, but there's 7 main ones. This is Thomas, Teresa, Newt, Minho, Chuck, Gally, and Fried Pan. He's the cook, and even he follows them along their journey, but he's not like super important to the plot. The other ones are more important. The one that we're going to be talking about for the ending mostly is Chuck. Chuck is kind of like the downplayed, kid who's younger than the rest, who's more innocent than the rest, the one that basically, doesn't deserve a bad ending. He deserves happiness, and he shouldn't be in this situation. But in a sad turn of events, something happens to Gally, and he is taken to a place, but you don't know that. You think that he's dead, and you kind of don't think he's going to come back. But as we said, the ending is very surprising, and at the end, when they try to escape from the maze, and they end in this place with all these doctors and everything, they see Gally again. And he's there, and he looks like he has been through the worst experience of his life. He's kind of, eyes bloodshot and very, pale and not looking well. And they kind of asked him, Gally, what's wrong? We thought you were dead, man. And he's like, get away from me. They've done something to me. And we don't really know who they is at that point, but he ends up grabbing some sort of weapon and killing Chuck. And Chuck's the most innocent of the bunch. And then Thomas, in a form of events, ends up having to kill Gally to make sure that they're all safe. Or does he? That's kind of the major plot point that leads to important events in later books.
So Gally had kind of gone out ahead of everybody else because he was the more headstrong leader as opposed to Thomas, who was a little more cerebral in leading the group and figuring his way through. So at the end they solve the maze, they get through it, and they come into what looks like a control room. And in the control room they find a bunch of dead persons. It looks like there had been a deadly shootout. and there's a woman who looked to be kind of the leader, and she's in a enclosed booth, and she's dead, but she has left a message, and a recorded message that they all see. And a recorded message basically says that this group, Wicked, had been attacked, and the people who solved the maze need to get out of there quickly and reform in another place. It's okay, you'll be taken care of, and that's basically what's told to them. And then right after that, a group of persons comes in dressed in somewhat battle costume, and they tell the remaining gladers that came through to come with us. We have to get out of here. You'll be safe with us. And they're whisked outside into what looks like a wasteland or a desert, and put into a helicopter / airplane kind of flying device, and are whisked away. And then you wonder, okay, where are they going? Who's behind all of this? What is driving all of this? What was the purpose of them being in this maze, in some cases for years, and being subjected to attacks by the grievers and the like? So that makes you want to see what happens next.
So in the next book, it's the Scorched Trials, and we're gonna take a little pause before we talk about that one to talk about more of the important things that we discovered in this book. So first off, who's your favorite character?
My favorite character in this book, I don't know if I have a particular favorite in this one, because actually my favorite shows up in the next set of books and the next set of movies. And he is one of the bad guys, or is he? I think in the books he's a little less of a bad guy, and in the movies a little more of a bad guy. In the books he's slightly ambiguous, but in the movie I would say he's more just a bad guy. He's trying to accomplish something good, but in a rather ruthless way. And he has his battles with some other people as to how to handle the gladers and how to move forward with what Wicked is actually trying to do. Because at this point, we still don't know what the point of this whole exercise of the maze was. Why are they doing it to these kids, and why? So that, again, sets the table for the next set of books and movies.
So my favorite character, as I kind of already talked about, is Newt. He's kind of like a second-in-command leader to, I guess, Gally, because Gally's kind of the leader. Although there is that other guy that's kind of like a leader, but I don't think it ends up well for him.
No.
Yeah, so there is another guy who's kind of in the beginning of the book who's more of a leader, but Gally kind of takes on responsibilities a little bit later, along with Thomas. But Newt is always kind of like that quiet, gentle second hand. Also, he kind of is almost a paternal figure to the rest of the gladers, and he really does care about each individual one of them. He tries to make sure that, they're well taken care for, and that they at least don't feel like they're alone in that world. And he's just overall very kind and sweet to the rest of the gladers, even though he does kind of have a really sad and depressing situation, which you learn about later in the series. Did you have a favorite part?
My favorite part was the end. As I said, when I had first seen the movie, I only saw it from maybe the second half on, and I thought, okay, this is kind of interesting. But then when I saw the end, I says, okay, now it's a mystery. I have to know what happens. So then when the movie came on television again, I was able to see it from the beginning. And Natalie at that point kind of walked in as I was watching, and she said, "What the heck is this?" And I said, "Well, this is Maze Runner." I think she was maybe somewhat familiar with the books. And the first thing she watched and was like, "What is this?" It's a bunch of guys in this glade kind of living almost like not exactly like the other book that has the boys on the island,
Oh, Lord of the
Lord of the
Flies.
Flies. It's much more cooperative than Lord of the Flies. We could think it as something like that, where a bunch of young boys, kind of teenaged years, are thrust out into their own. They have food and things to build shelter with in the glade, and the weather's generally pretty good, although it's kind of obvious they're in kind of a sort of a controlled atmosphere. Although it isn't readily apparent because it's day, it's night, the sky changes, but they're surrounded by this huge wall that goes around, so they can't just escape. They have to go through the maze doors that only open at certain times, and that's their only way out that they can see, because otherwise the walls that we didn't mention before go up extremely high and be almost impossible to scale. So once we all started watching again from the beginning, then our interest peaked because we got the character development. We saw that Gally was kind of the headstrong leader, and Thomas was the new guy who had to prove his worth, and then Teresa, who was the first female that kind of upset the balance of things, but launched a lot of the further adventures into motion. And you wondered who all these people were. Were they plants? Were some of them really aware of what was going on and just there to manipulate the others? Were they all unaware of where they had come from or why them? So again, that was another reason to continue reading and watching. And I think that our decision to go forward and read these and finally see the movies was very rewarding, because it did plot out a beginning to end story that made a lot of sense as to why the maze was constructed.
It's definitely a very sad dystopia. I mean, I've read a lot of dystopian books, and this one, most have a happy, ending and kind of like a hopeful type of thing. This one did not really do that, but it definitely had a very conclusive ending as to what the future was going to hold. And even though it was kind of like depressing and sad, it still is worth it to make it through the whole series. So that pretty much wraps up the first book, The Maze Runner. In our next talk, we'll be talking about the Scorched Trials. In this book, the plot starts to thicken and more characters emerge as the Gleaners finally realize what they're actually in for. They figure out more about the trials, more about Wicked, and more about what their life is going to be like in the next few years. In this, they also discover a vast landscape of what the world actually is. A kind of desert sand type of place known as only by the Scorch. And that's kind of where the next book is going. Hope you enjoyed. Bye!
Bye!